You know how sometimes you open a book and you feel that the author totally gets you, that they really know you and somehow are speaking directly to you? Do you ever wonder how authors do that? Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for writers, readers, and cooks. I'm Molly Stevens, and I'm here today with my co-host, Andrea Nguyen. I've been thinking a lot about how authors find their audiences, because really, an author without an audience is just a voice in the void. Andrea, do you have any specific audience in mind when you develop recipes or write your books?
Oh man, the voice in the void. You want to avoid being the voice in the void. When I'm freelancing for magazines and newspapers, I always consider their audience and the season, the amount of space that I'm given, but when I write my own books, I think about people who purchased my books in the past, who I engaged with, their comments. I also go back to my book proposal. We've talked a lot about the book proposal in the past, but you always want to carefully think about your end user.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And, we've talked before on the podcast about how if you are trying to write for everyone, you'll end up writing for no one. Food writing is not a one-size-fits-all situation. Different readers have different needs and they respond to different voices.
Oh, 100%. And there's also the element of how an audience grows over the course of your career. When you've got multiple books and multiple platforms and more people get to know you, your audience can change too. And that can affect your voice.
It is a lot to consider. And today's guest, Carla Lalli Music, is someone that many people will recognize from her time at Bon Appetit. She was food director and video star there. Carla now writes her own cookbooks, and Andrea and I are curious to speak with her about how she connects with her audience as effectively as she does. Carla, welcome to Everything Cookbooks.
Thanks for having me.
We are excited to talk to you today. Let's go back. When did you know that you wanted to work in food?
I don't think I really knew that I wanted to work in food until I went to culinary school, because up until that point, it was a hobby and it was like a big part of my family life, but it wasn't something that I ever connected to my livelihood or my profession until I started culinary school, which I went really sort of to explore, like, do I want to do this? And as soon as the first session started, it was like, this is it. I don't know what I'm going to end up doing in this field exactly, but I know that this is where I want to be. I want to work in food. My first restaurant job really came on the heels of that, because I got an externship while I was still a student at French Culinary Institute, which is now International Culinary Center. And I started working at Montrachet while I was still a student. And the first night service that I was in, the first day of my externship, the thrill was like, the adrenaline, the excitement, the energy, it was like that first plate went out and I was hooked, completely hooked.
Well, French Culinary Institute was on the heels of college.
Yeah, I actually took a couple years in between college and when I started working in restaurants, and I worked in book publishing. I worked in at an internet startup, like back in the before times internet. That second job, the internet job, they folded. So I was working there for about 7 or 8 months and the place got shut down. Everyone was given these little 6-week packages, salary packages. And it was in that kind of gap time that I decided to kind of switch careers. So I tell people all the time, getting fired is usually like a great thing. Not always.
Like your time to reset. Now, you mentioned that your family was about food and your mom was a restaurant critic. Mm-hmm. She was also an editor at Simon & Schuster. So you were kind of primed to think about food and to appreciate it and to think about, consider it from many different angles. And even the title of your second book, That Sounds So Good, that's something that your dad says, right?
Yeah. Essentially, that phrase works as the stamp of approval after, 7 million text messages or between the family about what we're going to eat when we see each other next. And it goes around and around and around. And then eventually, usually my dad will say, "Ooh, that sounds so good." And then we're like, great. And that's what we're having. Because my sister is a great cook. My mom is obviously still a great cook. My children are starting to cook. So yeah, there's a lot of opinions about food when we gather.
Are you one of those families that you don't leave one meal until you know where the next meal?
Kind of. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, waking up, eating breakfast, talking about what's for dinner.
Yes, yeah, that's sort of it. But you're one of those rare, so I mean, now you're obviously firmly a food writer or in food media, but you have a pretty serious professional career. So making that transition away from like that thrill of the first plate at Montrachet.
Yeah.
I mean, that's addictive stuff, but you eventually moved away and
Yeah. So it's funny because when I started working in restaurants, I thought that I had chosen this path in food that was very different from my mom's career, which was, as a writer and an editor and a cookbook editor, a cookbook author. And I was like, I'm a hardcore line cook, I'm like working in tiny little kitchens in New York City. And I really saw my path at that time towards working my way up in restaurants and eventually, hopefully becoming a chef and having my own business. And that was really exciting to me. So it was many, many years before you kind of realize that that food industry, especially as a business, is like very, very difficult. I had moved sort of out of cooking into back of house management, then into operations. And eventually I was the general manager at Shake Shack. And that was when I had this opportunity to just interview for a job at Everyday Food. And I kind of went on the interview almost on a lark because I thought, let's just see what this is about. And it was a Martha Stewart magazine. I thought, at the very least, I was going to have some good anecdote about, being interviewed or HR at, Martha Stewart, Omni Media. And I ended up getting that job. So it was weirdly connected to those first couple of years out of college where I worked in book editing. And all of a sudden it was like, oh, I have all this food knowledge, but I also from this, for a very short amount of time, also started to understand like editing and how, manuscripts go through the proof process and kind of having a voice and understanding editing and writing. And then because of working in restaurants for so long, I also kind of had this experience of writing menus and developing recipes in that context. So it's not that, it's sort of a half step. You have to kind of change your perspective, but developing recipes with cooks who work in restaurants to working with cooks who work in the test kitchen is just really, it was like a shift of perspective that I felt more equipped than someone who had never worked in a magazine should have felt, to come in as a deputy editor at that point.
Yeah. That Everyday Food, it's gone. I don't remember when it went.
I guess they would say it has morphed into a fully digital entity, but I don't know how much new recipe development they're doing there.
Right. But I'm trying to remember how long it's run. It was for listeners who don't remember, but it was that little digest size. It was kind of like a Reader's Digest.
Exactly. Yeah. And the beauty of it, I think, was it was like 50 or 60 recipes every month. It was really robust. And
right.
For someone who didn't really know how to do like truly reporting or long form journalism, for me, it was like, great that we have to use like very few words.
Interesting. Yeah.
But I mean, that arc that you just traced, Carla, explains why you were able to enter in at Bon Appetit as a deputy editor.
Yeah.
I think that, a lot of times people nowadays, especially with social media, like TikTok sensations and Instagram influencers, that there are these bizarre overnight successes.
Right.
And I'm old school, man. I just think like, I'm in it for the long haul. Yeah. And I really love food and I really love media. And I think that one of the things that Molly and I appreciate so much about your work and who you are is that while you have these fresh perspectives and a fresh voice, you've really done a lot.
Mm-hmm. Thank
you. Yeah.
One of the things that we wanted to know is that you have this very special voice that directly speaks to your audience.
Mm-hmm.
You know your audience so well. Did you create that audience or did the audience come to you? Or how did you shape your understanding of your audience and who comprises that?
Yeah, it's interesting to think about and kind of track back because, social media for me didn't really start until I got to Bon Appetit, just because of the timing of it. Like Instagram was still very new, and during the 9 years that I spent at Bon Appetit, it grew and kind of allowed me to grow kind of with the popularity of the magazine. So it was important for me to I knew the brand voice so well, the Bon Appetit voice so well, that actually sort of figuring out what my voice was like sometimes tricky, because I would not know, which one to use. Like, was I going to use this like a little bit removed journalistic voice if I was writing a story and not using I? Like, it was a long time before I could use I in any story that I wrote for Bon Appetit, 5 years before I wrote a story with I in it. So I would sort of write in this brand voice.
Because that was what was being asked of you as a staffer.
Yeah, that was the assignment. I think that it grew once I had the permission to write as myself. The best advice I got was to just write the way you talk. So my editor told me, like, you're a good talker. Basically, like, I had done like 2 or 3 drafts on this story where I was writing in the first person. And it was like trying to be something that I thought you were supposed to be. I couldn't figure it out. And my editor was just like, you're a good talker. Just write the way you talk. Pretend that you're talking to a friend, describing something. And that was really liberating and amazing. That didn't ever occur to me. And that's where I felt like finding personality in writing could kind of finally come through. It's tricky though, because you have to be like a slightly turned up version of yourself, always. And I definitely found that when I started doing video, it was like you're being yourself, but this like turned to 11, sort of slightly exaggerated. You're performing as yourself,
Yeah, that's really well said. Yeah.
Yeah. I was lucky enough also at Bon Appetit to work with really good social media managers who taught me so much about captions and, combining text and an image and being like sort of aware of trends without mimicking. And, that's why, Andrea, I look at TikTok and I'm like, I am so out of my depth. Like, I know the best thing to do would just be to like start experimenting and playing around, but it's hard to feel like it's a new platform when you're coming from other platforms that you've been on for a long time.
Yeah, I look at TikTok and it's bewildering to me.
Yeah.
When I've actually talked to book marketers about the efficiency of TikTok, their response was, it really doesn't convert people into buyers. It's a low conversion rate. So then I turned around and I asked some young people about that. And they're like, oh yeah, we wouldn't buy anything. We just watch TikTok for fun.
Interesting.
And I was like, that's interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
But then there's the balance of they're watching for fun, but they're developing an awareness of whatever it is they're watching. So maybe they've never heard of you, Carla.
Right.
I can't imagine how anybody hasn't, but they haven't heard of you and they see a couple TikToks with you. And then next time they're looking for something a little more in depth, or they're at a different place in their lives where they might be looking to buy. There's some name recognition, brand recognition that comes along.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I have really not worked on developing my audience there. And I have a feeling if I turn my attention to it, because I really do like consuming media on TikTok, although it's extremely dangerous. Like, there's no such thing as 10 minutes of TikTok, that means 2 hours. It's dangerous in that way. But I really do find it super entertaining. And I've learned a lot, like following people who are not in my field. So there's gardening TikTok and there's makeup TikTok and there's, cleaning TikTok. Right. That is it's really fun and entertaining to me. But as a creator, I haven't figured it out.
Yeah. I mean, I think that you have to decide how much energy you have, especially when you're a freelancer or you're a sole operator, you're a sole proprietorship. That's what we check off on our tax,
Right.
forms.
Exactly.
Right.
And so you have to pick and choose where you want to put your efforts into, because there's only so many hours of the day. And you, Carla, have a family to feed.
Yeah. Yeah. You really realize when you're out on your own, like time is money, like what should I be doing?
Yeah. It's so interesting too, how you like how your audience that you developed, I mean, and all that you learned while you were at Bon Appetit, that was timing, right? Because you learned all that about video and YouTube and things that you've been able to bring with you into your freelance career. Right. And right now to learn a new medium.
Yeah. It's like a whole new language,
It's interesting.
Let's talk about language, because you have like this really cool language that you've put into both of your books, Where Cooking Begins and That Sounds So Good. And there's like this incredible economy and efficiency that you build into the recipes, where you are injecting the efficiency of a pro kitchen into a home kitchen situation. Tell us a little bit more about how you developed that particular approach.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of so many things. It was really important to me when I started writing Where Cooking Begins. I don't think I even in the process of writing the book, I learned this about myself, that when I had an idea for a recipe or started cooking something that was written down on my outline, it was a recipe that had to be developed for whatever chapter. If I didn't have something in the house that I thought I had when I set out that day to develop that recipe, I would use something else. Like, it was very difficult for me to go to the store for something if I was missing an ingredient that I could imagine making it a different way. And I think for most cooks, like, even the recipes we make all the time, we don't make it the same exact way every time. Like, when you start cooking from memory or from, just from instinct, you might do it this way one day, you might do it slightly different the next, depending on what's in season, depending on what you have in the house. And so I realized, like, I can't ask my readers to be super rigid about this recipe and always make it with fennel and never use celery if I don't follow those rules. So that led to putting the spinach section into all the recipes. So that's like where I was offering swaps and suggestions for alternate ingredients. And that was really there to give beginner cooks the confidence to know that, like, if you don't have the 1/4 teaspoon of coriander, like, it's going to be okay. Like, don't not make the recipe, And then also sort of to more experienced cooks who I think look at the ingredient list, look at the image, scan a little and go like, I get it. And then they're going to do their own thing. Like, wanted to feel that both people could connect with the recipes that I was writing. And the other goal was to have the recipes read more in that same voice of someone is talking you through it, rather than this idea that recipes are technical language, which in media, they're treated not as prose, but as technical language. And I'm sure you've both gotten that style sheet from the publisher. And it's every time you say this, you have to say it like this. And having edited recipes for years at that point, it gets tiresome, It's like what order you add the fat before, how the ingredients have to go into the pan, things like that. Cook stirring occasionally until whatever TK minutes. And I wanted the recipes to feel as kind of personal as the rest of the writing. So paying attention to visual cues became like a really big help that I felt like I think we take for granted, like cook until, dark brown. Well, as you learn when you start talking to like less experienced cooks, what does that mean?
Right.
And so describing something as like the color of a walnut, or, the color of a brown paper bag, or the color of a russet potato, like just trying to help people more. And it helped me actually pay attention. So as I was developing the recipes, I would sort of stare into the skillet and go like, what is because you stop seeing it when you're experienced. You just kind of know, what's going on. And then sort of like watching and seeing things shrivel or change color or get juicy or, go from this to this. Or I think those cues really, really help people at home. And the closer they get to what your intention is, the better their results are going to be.
So pushing yourself in language choice to find something and not to rely on things that we see and we don't even, as experienced cooks, it's that thing of competency that you don't even absorb that until brown, because you know what they're talking about.
You guys, let's talk about the stare, because I think the three of us all stand there at the stove and stare.
Right. Yeah.
And like you're standing there, you're looking in the pot. And then there's almost like I remove myself in an out-of-body experience.
Yeah.
I'm the cook who's looking at the recipe objectively and going, what the hell is going on?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that is the moment of being a good recipe developer and writer, all right? Where you're just like, you know what? Browning in 2 to 3 minutes. What the hell does that mean? can we help the cook a little bit more if it's something that's unfamiliar? And I think that, Carla, you make it sound so easy, and Molly, in your writing, it sounds so easy, but we all know that it's hard to come up with those kinds of cues, you know, or just like when the meat changes color or it loses its raw look instead of like it's brown. And it's like, dude, the meat's never going to brown in like 1 minute.
Right.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I think also from, you know, being a working mother and having caretakers, actually having dinner with my kids every night during the week, because I didn't get home early enough. I was teaching these young cooks how to cook meals that, you know, were the kinds of things my kids like to eat on the weekends. And that was actually, so that was such a great test case, like such a great sort of sample population, because they were people who were young, who were kind of like pressed for time, who had the desire to make dinner, wanted to do it, but maybe didn't know how. And then I would try out recipes all the time for our caretakers, and then come home and go like, oh, that's what dark golden brown means to you. Like, that wasn't descriptive enough, because that is pale gray to me. And that was incredibly sort of illuminating, trying out recipes on these young people who worked with us.
And you learn what's difficult to some people that you would just not assume.
Yeah. And even with good, you know, good equipment and a stove that, you know, gets really, really hot, I think one of the main things is people just do not trust themselves to turn the heat up high enough and to let things sit long enough to actually take on color. That's like a key thing.
Yeah. The browning.
Yeah.
It's like brownie, you know.
Life without browning. What's the point?
Oh, it's very pale and bland. You know, we often like hear how food and recipes and cookbooks are full of inspirations, right? There's like this romanticism about it. And you introduce this kind of wit and sarcasm and reality into your writing, your personality and your voice. When do you decide to like really push it and just be a little bit sarcastic? You know, when do you like introduce that reality, and when do you inspire? Because you do a little bit of both.
It's kind of like the difference between this new book with the Monday through Thursday and then the weekend.
Yeah.
It's sort of that balance where sometimes you're like, you know, let's face it, we just got to get this on the table, and yes, it should be good. And then other times it's okay to tackle something hard. I mean, I'm thinking, Andrea, the example about the fish stock. Telling you to use fish stock is just setting you up for failure. And so you're acknowledging the reality that there's got to be a workaround or something.
Yeah, I think part of that came from experience. I think part of it came from, I wrote That Sounds So Good during the pandemic, and there was just a lot of getting slapped in the face going on. And so there may have been a little bit of an irreverence or just a reality check of how hard it is to cook every day, because having, you know, been in test kitchen environments for a long time, once I transitioned and I was fully cooking at home, and also those nights of working too late at the office to cook dinner for my family, well, that was gone too, because I was developing a book and cooking for the entire family 3 meals a day, every single day. I think I just maybe was like over it and tired, and felt that we probably anyone who was cooking around that time was, you know, going through a similar feeling of, this is fantastic. And if you love cooking, like, you sure got to love it a lot during that time. But also just to be like, I can't do this for another day, you know? So there might've been some of that sneaking through, and just feedback also from writing the first book, and from the types of questions that I get, and from knowing what kinds of recipes get what kinds of comments, and just learning. You're getting a lot with the internet as opposed to books or magazines. You get a lot of feedback, and it is quick, and it is very direct, and sometimes it is not very, you know, nice, but you hear back from people, and it's a good kind of gut check. I'm also I grew up in New York City, and I'm a very sarcastic person. So It's actually something I try to.
No, and I'm also thinking about the Sunday ragu. So you have a recipe, but then you have this really like sweet and interesting essay about your Italian American family. And I feel like there's that balance of where you're like inspiring people. It's like, hey, this is an Italian American, a very New York recipe.
Right.
But realistically, that's not how I grew up.
Yeah. I had never made a ragu before, and it's a funny thing of, again, editing lots and lots of recipes, tasting these things, eating them, going out, thinking about them, and then realizing like, I've never cooked my own. I mean, Thanksgiving dinner was like that for me because I had edited 10 years worth of Thanksgiving issues and made Thanksgiving recipe videos and like all of this stuff. But I had never cooked my own because my mom always hosted. So it's this weird thing of being an adult and like, I would like to cook Thanksgiving, and then realizing it would be really nice to have a second oven, like things, that I never had to,
to think
actually
about.
deal with. Yeah.
Right. Like these gaps in your own experience. I mean, we've established you have this incredibly broad and rich experience, but yet there are these gaps.
Yeah.
And if you're trying to present these, and there's an honesty that you're trying to present in not just over romanticize. The essay made me think you do this incredible economy in the writing of the recipes, and yet you allow yourself, I didn't count, but the inbred together, I love you, let's eat, the Sunday ragu, these sort of more expansive, more lyrical essays that I think cap the several chapters.
Yeah.
Is this you sort of expanding your voice or developing moving beyond recipes? I mean, you went from everyday food where it was just the recipes and, very, very compact to sort of expanding this voice at Bon App and now like actual essays without recipes.
Yeah, I think that was driven from the experience that I had picked up the, 2.5 years in between the books. And also the motivation for That Sounds So Good was this emotional connection to food that I'm certainly not the first person to notice or write about or be moved by. But after I wrote Where Cooking Begins, I had the opportunity to go on tour and to meet a lot of people who had cooked the recipes or had watched the videos. And there were just these really touching stories about how they created, important memories or important moments in people's lives. And I was like, that's what it is for me too,
Yeah.
And I wanted to kind of write about leaning into that, and that essentially the reason I do what I do is because I want to give people a reason to cook, because I believe that it will just enrich your life and make it a little bit better and funner and nicer and create these moments, whether they're memories or reasons to gather or, special occasions or very everyday occasions. Like if I can help someone figure out how to incorporate that into their life, I think their life is going to be better. So the essays were about the way that food has like touched me or touched my family and been the source of, comfort and reward or just creative expression, meditation, achievement. Like it can be all of those things for people. It could be a meditation for someone, or it could be a combination of all of those things for a cook. So I wanted to get at that. And it just gave me an opportunity to really like think about it, memory and flavors and things my mom had cooked and why we like to eat when we get together.
It really comes through, and it's just an interesting choice to me sort of structurally, how you've kept your recipes. We talked about, being a little snarky, a little sarcastic and, quick, and your recipes, you have kept this sort of economy in the recipes to make them very doable because sometimes putting that much love it's a lot of love and thought into the recipes themselves could weigh them down and maybe defeat the promise of this book. So you found a structure that allows you to offer both. It's an interesting, as someone who puts together books, I'm like, oh, that's kind of smart.
I think the economy also comes from design. At Everyday Food, on a digest size page, you really don't get a lot of words or ingredients. And then anyone who's worked in a magazine or in books has had that push-pull with design about like how big that text box is going to be, and can we please move the margin and like open that up, and the text is too small, but I wrote this many words. So working with my designer on That Sounds So Good and Where Cooking Begins, like I didn't want recipes that were going to break and put 7 lines on the next page. You know, if you're going to go on to a second page, it's like, because I really need the space to explain like a pastry recipe. Or if it's 7 lines over, I'm going to do everything I can to get it to fit on one page so that, you know, the cook, it's just so much easier to follow. And sometimes those choices just forced me to be a little bit ruthless with myself with cutting. So sometimes I had space to kind of say a little bit more, and sometimes I didn't. And I think my editor, Francis Lamb, like in between the first and second proof, he was like, I think he called it my like heroic, like ability to cut myself. And it's like, I'd rather cut my own writing than have an editor do it for me. So sometimes it's like, we're 4 lines over, I can take a whack at it, or you can. And it's like, I'll do it, you know? It's like,
yeah. No, it's like, I you know, I don't have children, so I'm like, I think I'm going to kill my babies now.
It is like that. Yeah.
Let me ask you something. So your instructions, sometimes you have articles and determiners and sometimes you don't.
Yeah.
I tried not including articles and determiners in certain parts of Evergreen Vietnamese, and the copy editors would not have it. They put them back in.
I know.
How do you convince people?
Between writing the manuscript for Where Cooking Begins and getting the first pass back, they put every single article back in, and I lost my mind. And then we just had to have a conversation about it with my editor and put it into my author style sheet. And, you know, it was going to be like sometimes, but not all the time. And it just kind of came back as like this little ticket attached to my recipes that was saying the author doesn't want to use them. And so we're going to try to use them as little as possible unless the clarity of the instruction is lost. And then it's like, put it back in. So we had established that with the first book. So I was able, being with the same publisher for the second book, to be like, oh yeah, remember that thing? Like, I don't want to say you know, every single time.
That's the hardest element of style sheet to do, where you're saying sometimes, but not always.
Yeah, no.
But then I go back to what you said at the top of the podcast, where you were learning to write in your own voice. Your editor who encouraged you to write like you speak. Mm-hmm. Well, we don't speak this. Sometimes we use articles, sometimes we don't. Right. And so it's to stick with that, and a copy editor who, and I understand it's a hard job, and they're looking for rules to follow, and either there are articles or there are not articles.
Exactly.
It's like, well, no, sometimes there are and sometimes there aren't. So
yeah, we don't walk around going, take the chicken out of the pot. You know, it's like, whatever. It doesn't sound right. And then when you have to cut, it's like, well, those are the first things to go.
In noticing that, which seems like such an insignificant thing to a casual observer, is, like you said, it was a huge battle to get it there. And it gives the writing a certain cadence, a certain rhythm that is Carla. Right. I mean, this is your rhythm, and that's good to know.
Yeah, it was not easy, Andrea. So
okay,
and you have to pick. You know, you have to pick your fights when you're getting a cookbook done, and like, how hard am I going to push on this? Am I going to push hard on everything? Is everyone going to just have had it with me by the end of this? Or are you going to, they're all creative projects and they're collaborations. So as it goes through rounds and rounds, other people are involved.
And sometimes they sneak shit back in, right?
That's right. And they sneak it back in. Yeah.
But, you know, you're talking about design earlier, and one of the things, and we talked about these, every recipe has from the market and then at home, just to sort of to give the reader at a glance what you need to pick up at the market and what you should have in your pantry. Yes. And then 2 different versions of how to spin things, you know, these variations, these improvisations. And your commitment, your decision to put those on every recipe, you immediately gave yourself a design constraint because they take up a chunk of page. When I first started, I love those. I think they're just great. And especially for someone who, you know, knows their way around, they're like, oh, this is so much fun. Or if, like you said, you don't know your way around the kitchen. But I was really surprised and impressed that I thought, well, maybe these will just be on some recipes that Carla feels, you know, particularly inspired about. But you went ahead and just put them on every single one.
I did.
were there times when you're like, maybe I don't want to spin this one?
Yeah, you would finish writing up the recipe because there's so many phases to getting a recipe from conception to being written down. And you finally finish writing it up. And writing recipes, even after this long, it takes so much longer than I think it's going to take. I'm like, oh, it's a super simple recipe. I'm going to write it up. And then you get into it and you're like, well, actually, what is the best way to say this? And, it just takes longer than you think, especially if you don't want it to sound rote. And then I would finish the recipe and be like, oh, no, you are not done. You got to do market and home and all of your spinets. And yeah, sometimes I would curse myself like, wow, you really made your life difficult, didn't you? But I'm glad that it wasn't here and there. I'm glad that I just leaned into it because it is pretty much a universal way of thinking about food. Like it's all the time. You can make a choice. Even like I made my son toast with peanut butter this morning before he would on the way to school. He ended up leaving it on the kitchen counter and then I ate it 5 hours later, which a lot of parents can relate. Like you're like, oh, someone left this here, I'll eat it. But it was, it was just toast with peanut butter. But I had all these decisions to make. Like, should I butter the bread and then put peanut butter on? How toasted? Which bread am I going to use? And then I added salt to it. And then you could keep going. I could do a drizzle of olive oil, but he loves hot honey. So I did a drizzle of hot honey and the flaky salt. And, those are choices. And if I could make it again tomorrow and put maple syrup and salt and pepper on it, and it would still be the peanut butter toast, but it's like all these different ways you can just kind of do what you feel like in the moment. That's really fun. That's where the creative part of cooking kind of comes in, and you think of something and try a different flavor combination and you can transform it,
That feels to me, as you explain that, incredibly true, but also part of your voice and what your audience is looking for from you, as you are this intensely creative cook. You're always looking at other ways to do things. And it also suggests to me sort of a back and forth with your audience, like a riffing back and forth.
Yeah, I try to just be really permissive because people have these are very subjective choices, and it could be sort of almost cliche things like anchovies. Like some people like them and some people don't. So as recipe developers, feel obligated to be like, right, I get it. Like you anchovy people, if you don't want it, just leave it out. But really wanting people to find their own creativity in it and seeing me, like when I do videos, sometimes I'm doing videos that are based on recipes in the book. And I look at the recipe and I'm like, that's weird. Like, why did I write, literally, why did I write it that way? And we're going to do it a different way. And I'm going to show you, I'm going to prove to you in the making of this that I'm not even going to listen to my own former self. And I really just want people to feel, if it's creativity or if it's just sort of freedom from that, that's how you develop your own personal je ne sais quoi in your own kitchen. Like I want everybody to find that. And when people write to me and they're like, oh, we made your this, but I didn't have one of the ingredients. So we substituted it with this other thing. And it was really good. And I'm like, good for you, awesome. Genius switch, should have included that in the spinach. It's cool. It's fun. It's also a waste reducing way of cooking, especially during the pandemic when certain ingredients were very hard to find. It was really important to be able to think of okay, well, I can't get this. So what can I use instead? Because literally there's no, chicken is a bad example. But one time I couldn't get chicken and I got duck. And then I was like, cool, now you have to cook a duck. But it was all right, different bird. We can do this.
So here's the question, developing recipes, knowing that you're wanting them to be able to be permissive and to get people to learn from them and develop their own. I imagine that has to influence your recipe development because there's certain recipes that aren't that fluid maybe, or there's certain techniques and if you ever done a recipe and it didn't have that flexibility in it and it sort of didn't deliver on your promise.
Yeah, there's some times where there are fewer swaps, especially in baking. I know there are pastry chefs and bakers who feel their way through substitutions, but I'm not there. So sometimes I would get to the end of a dessert recipe and it's like all-purpose flour, like you need to use all-purpose flour. Like I'm not skilled enough in that to say you could use a different sugar or those things really make big differences. But there are a few recipes where I would say you can substitute this for this, but it's not really going to be the same anymore. So I think I wrote about this in a caption, but if you're set out to make chicken adobo and you have neither vinegar nor peppercorns, then you could use, an amount of citrus juice and something else and maybe a different kind of pepper, but like, don't call it adobo. Like it's good. It's still going to be good, but it's not that dish anymore. Or similarly, like with cacio e pepe, if you make it with mozzarella and cheddar, it's something. And I'm sure it's going to taste good, but but it's no longer that dish anymore. So
right. So then you're setting parameters.
You need to have some thoughtfulness.
Mm-hmm.
I think there was another recipe that maybe called for kimchi, and I was like, if you really can't find it, you could use sauerkraut in that particular application and something spicy, but like it's not the same, because sometimes it can be culturally insensitive and it can be sort of, this hodgepodge of like ingredient blender that just starts to be like a mess. So yeah, I do want people to be thoughtful about it. And that there are some, guardrails. So sometimes you can do it and sometimes you can't.
That could be another, could go at home, spin it, guardrails.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Don't go that far.
Yes.
How does the cooking show and also your podcast with Rick Martinez inform your books, and how do you engage with our audience in all these many ways?
Yeah, the launching the YouTube channel was definitely in tandem with the publication of That Sounds So Good. And it just provides a different entry point for people to get acquainted with the book. And I still have lots of people who are big fans who needed to kind of be convinced that they would like the book. And they were convinced by watching me make a few recipes and then trying those and being like, this was really great. I'm going to go buy your book. It's also, I think, an economy of creative output, which is, it's hard to write 100 recipes and it takes 2 years to write a book. And those recipes exist. And I'm excited to get to re-engage with them in a different platform. So there's the written recipe, there's images of the recipes, and then there's going to be my performance of the recipe. Someone very early on is so annoying. I hate even saying this because 99% of the comments I get are positive, but the ones that I remember are the haters. And like, I wish we could change the human brain.
Yeah.
So there was someone who early on after the launch of the YouTube channel that was connected to the book, they were like, wow, Carla, the book came out like a couple months ago and you're still making recipes from the book. And where's your creativity? It's like a really bad look.
Oh, God.
Do you say that to Lady Gaga when she goes on tour with her album? The album came out, okay? And now we're on tour.
Yeah.
And we're performing. Right. Just like a musician would write songs and have the recorded version of them, and then you want to go see him do it live. Like that's what this is. But once in a while I will kind of I want to make a new recipe, or I want to develop, or I started making something at home and I haven't written up the recipe for it, but I really like this dish and I made it a few times. There's a gochujang broiled salmon that I did for the YouTube channel, which really came out of something I was making at home and thought like, oh, this is the kind of recipe people would really like. And then I actually developed it for real. So, but it definitely the majority of the recipes are still from That Sounds So Good, but I'm going to run that down, and I'm already thinking about new original development and how that works when I don't have a book contract and I'm just kind of, I hope, just able to be creative and play around a little bit. Because there's definitely a creative slump. I don't know if you guys have experienced this, but when you finish the book, your most recent book, and feeling like, woof, I need to gas this tank up again.
Yeah, we were just talking about it yesterday. Yep.
Yeah.
It's a flattening.
Yeah, you're like a flat tire. And you're like, please pump me up.
Yeah. And how do you
find,
where do you go to find that again?
I go out. I mean,
Yeah.
I used to go out and I travel, and that's not as easy to do anymore. But I start reading other people's books because now I have the time to do that, right?
I also find that it's hard to read others' cookbooks when I'm really deep into working on one.
Definitely.
Because I have a lot of anxiety and crisis of confidence sometimes. And if I start reading some of my favorite books or to do books that blow me away, I'm just like, oh my God, what am I even doing, trying to do? It's so when you finish a project, there's often, a batch of new books you haven't seen or you haven't been able to look at some of your favorite ones. So I find that very exciting and inspirational.
Yeah. I enjoy that very much too.
How do you see yourself evolving with your audience? Because you do have these very powerful modes of communication through YouTube, through the podcasts, borderline salty, as well as Instagram.
Yeah.
How do you see that moving forward?
I don't know right now because I feel a little comfortable with doing things the way I've been doing them for a while. So the YouTube channel is around a year old now, a little bit older than a year. And yeah, I love where we've gotten with the style of the videos, with the production value, with my team who I work with every time. But sometimes I just want to do it a little differently. So I feel that like itch starting, but I don't know how really to reimagine it. YouTube's tricky too, because again, like whether a video is successful or not is not just up to you. It's up to some amorphous rule about what's going to capture people's attention and data and SEO. And that can be a real creativity like killer. And then similarly on Instagram, it's just, I'm a little bored of myself right now. And I'm a little bored of like everything. And so looking for things that feel different, that are fun. I mean, we used to look at Instagram all the time to find creative inspiration and images, and people were doing it differently and different styles and like things, would be, I think this happens on TikTok too. New things that you had never heard of would be created, like unicorn toast. And like, well, what is that? And it's just been a while since there was another creator who I followed, who I felt like that was really seeing things differently. So I'm looking for that inspiration, and I'm not sure it's going to come necessarily like from myself. I think to your point, Andrea, it comes from like going out and seeing different things, tasting different things, traveling again, having some new little spark of inspiration or being introduced to a new ingredient or whatever that is. But so yeah, right now I don't know. I just feel a little, I don't want to say stuck in a rut, but I definitely feel the urge to push the creativity, but it's like, I know I want to, but I haven't found the exact like inspiration yet. So we'll see. Being irreverent helps. Taking more risk, I think, helps. Not playing it safe. If you're playing it safe and something bombs, then you're like, why am I even playing it safe? I can't anticipate what people,
right.
And if you're doing that and trying to make it work and then it falls flat, then it's like, well, then what's the point? So just do whatever you feel like and stop paying attention to numbers, or it's just all of these platforms exist to like literally force us to compare ourselves to each other.
Correct. And it is a race in popularity. But, I always think at the end of the day, my husband, who's not on social media, he says, how are you making money from this?
Right.
Right.
I mean, that's the thing. I mean, we've freelance and this is part of our livelihood. And these platforms are great for dialogue, but they're also taking the fun out of that dialogue because there's this drive to be popular and to do like these kinds of inane showmanship in terms of video. And some of it's fun, but then other things I'm just like, that's not really moving me.
Yeah.
So I'm sort of, I feel what you're feeling, Carla, in the sense of there's so much that is expected, and I don't know how that's being fed to me from the various algorithms that are being formed too.
Yeah, I spent time the other day with someone I used to work with at Bon Appetit, who's really smart and works as a social media consultant now. And they were saying that they posted something recently that did really, really well and was a different tone, different content than what they usually post. And it got a ton of engagement and it got a ton of comments and people were sharing it and it really broke through and it was awesome. And she told me that after that post did so well, she actually lost a couple hundred followers. And I was like, what do you mean? That doesn't make any sense. She was like, well, sometimes when a post does really well, it'll push out to people who haven't engaged in your content for a while. And then this will pop up after you've kind of been invisible to them. And then they'll go like, oh, I still follow her. I should unfollow. I haven't seen anything from this person in like a couple months. Like I forgot I was still following them and then like unfollow. So this just irony of, something that did really resonate with her audience and her community caused her to like lose followers, which we all think means you're doing bad. But it's like, no, embrace it. Let those people go. And then the people who stick around actually like want to be there. So your engagement will probably go up, even though your total number goes down. I don't know. I just wish we could give ourselves a break.
I agree. I think about what you were saying at the beginning about developing your own voice. And when you're on YouTube or even when you're on the pages of your book, you are authentically who you are, but a little louder, a little more. And I think we all are to some extent. It's a part of ourselves that we're presenting to the world as author, presenter. Yeah. And because there is a connection to our authentic self, we change, we evolve. And if we choose to continue to put ourselves out there, that image will change and evolve, and a certain amount of our audience is going to come along with us, and others are going to have liked that moment in time when you were whatever. Yeah. So it's tricky business. And I think that, you bring so much life to your book through the YouTube. I mean, that's sort of I love the analogy of a musician going on tour with their recipes. And that's work too. You talk to any musician who does that and they get out there and they seem like they're having such a good time. And you talk to them like, oh my God, it's grueling.
Yeah,
it's grueling.
Playing my greatest hits for like the nth time.
Right.
Talk to the Stones, right?
Yes.
Yeah. What do we want to hear if we're going to go to a Stones concert? So,
how often are you making a YouTube?
We film every 4 weeks for 2 days.
Okay.
Just sort of playing around with how many videos to push out of those 2 days. Usually it's 2 recipes per day. But if the recipes are very simple and like summer recipes that don't require like swaps and long periods of cooking, we can do 3. But at the end of the 2 days, I'm trashed. I take my makeup off. I take a shower. I need to be horizontal like immediately. It's very physically and emotionally draining because it is a performance,
And I'm sure the few days leading up to it are all the planning and
prepping and storyboarding. Yeah. The episodes on Carla's cooking show on YouTube are really fun, and they're professionally produced and I think very engaging. And you know your people. It's about finding your people. And I think that that's what goes back to what we're all saying about authenticity and our voice, is that first find your people and then, start talking to them and seeing what they need.
Yeah, it's just funny because pretty frequently there will be someone who comments like, oh my God, I used to love you so much and I'm a huge fan and I didn't know that you had a YouTube channel. And it's like, okay, if you're a huge fan, then like you would definitely know this. So, again, it's like people are discovering you all the time. Again, like trying to lean into and be gratified by the people who say like nice things like that, and just ignoring people who aren't into it. Like, you're not into it, then great. Like, we shouldn't go on a date then,
Right.
You should turn it off.
You should date someone else.
Yes. Oh, well.
It is a matchmaking process.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, we'll put all the links to your books and ways for people to follow you in the show notes. But Carla, is there anything specific that either you want to tell us you're working on or parting words?
Yeah, I think if you haven't checked out That Sounds So Good, watch a few of the videos and watch me make something that maybe you're not sure you can make on your own. And hopefully I'll inspire you to do so.
Well, thank you so much for spending time with us.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Carla.
Such a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Everything Cookbooks. Find more episodes of Everything Cookbooks at Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. Contact us at our website, everythingcookbooks.com. Please leave us a review. This helps more people find the show and builds our community. Any books mentioned on the show can be found on our affiliate page at bookshop.org. Thanks to our talented editor, Abby Circatella, and until next time, keep on writing, reading, and cooking.